Hi. In this video demonstration, we're going to take a look at some more particle effects and some metaballs, blob mesh kind of stuff. Today we're going to do a kind of a wax strip simulation or animation here using particle flow, something along the lines of this guy right here, where we can start to see some thinning and stringy drips that that might appear, coming down a candle or something along those lines. Okay, I'm going to close that out and we'll just go ahead and get started. I've got a brand new 3D Studio scene here, and I'm going to need a couple of things to get going. First thing I'm going to need is a sphere, something fairly round. Now, a candle shape that's got kind of rounded edges on the top will work just fine for this. I've done it the same way, but for simplicity's sake, let's go ahead and start by making a sphere. I'm going to go ahead and give my sphere over on my Modify tab maybe a radius of about 440, not 4 is a little small there. As we like to work in generic units when we're doing particle simulations and flows, I'm going to go ahead and lift that up to, kind of the 0 line there, which would be about, 40 on the z-axis, same as our radius. And we're going to drip some wax down the sides here. We're also going to need a few space warps, so let's go back to our Create tab, all the way over here to the 3 wavy line space warps button, as my students like to call it, the bacon button. And we're going to need a couple of forces. Let's start with, of course, we're going to need a gravity. And I'm going to go ahead and create a couple of winds. I'll create the winds here in my front viewport. One, and then we'll just copy that wind. Hold down Shift and drag, and we'll mark that as a copy. The winds will be used for a little bit of turbulence so that our wax strips aren't perfectly in line and straight. And then one more thing we're going to need is not a force, but we'll go down to the deflectors from the drop down, and we are going to need a U deflector so that the surface of our sphere can deflect some of these particles. I'll create that guy in the top view there as well, and we'll just kind of bunch these guys all together here so that we've got fairly easy access to them. Here we go. That's all we should need. Let's go ahead and talk about the settings for these guys first. Let's go to our gravity and go to our Modify tab here. I don't need much gravity. Let's start with something very, very slight, like a 0.1, just enough to get the drops to fall onto our sphere here. Move over to our first wind. And that is, once again, I'm going to use wind, but I'm not going to have any strength on it whatsoever. All I want is something from the turbulence area of settings here. Maybe about a 0.6 for turbulence on this one, something real small for the scale, 0.03 to 0.05. And we'll raise the scale up fairly large on that one. And then the next one will have something just a little bit different. Again, with no strength. Turbulence, we'll go with about 1. Maybe frequency of 0.02, something even smaller, and a smaller scale, maybe half that, just 0.1 there. Okay, that should do us fairly well. On our U deflector here, we want to pick the sphere first, and then I'm going to turn off the bounce since I only want it to stop these particles. And I don't want them bouncing off like we did with, say, our rain simulation with splashes and chaos and stuff like that. So we'll just turn that all off and leave it ready to go there. All right. Next, we can jump into particle flow. I like to do that. Make sure you've got your keyboard shortcut override toggle. That's this guy right up here, turned on. And then you can hit 6 on your keyboard to open up particle flow window. First things first, I like to drag out our empty flow and select the title bar right away because we've always got to make a couple of changes here. The changes we're going to make on this one are going to be, as always, change the viewport percent to 100% so we can see what we're doing. And we're going to actually change the icon type here to something that matches our model a little bit more like circular, which is, pretty good for candles and spheres and anything else that's got a round shape to it. So we're going to change the icon type to circle, and we'll give it a diameter. What did I make the sphere? About 40, so we'll give it something smaller. It's about 25 there. Okay, our icon has shown up now right underneath our sphere at 0, 0. Just to be certain, I'm going to grab my sphere and right click down here on the X and the Y location just to center it. Exactly like my icon immediately starts for me. because we made it in here. It goes to 0, 0, 0 on the grid line. And then I want to raise it up above our sphere, maybe about 100, well, that's a little far. We don't probably need that much, maybe 150, just so that it's above the sphere, because we want these to drop down onto it and then drip around the sides like a melting candle was dripping onto something, a skull in the laboratory of some sort of mad witch scientist or something, who knows. But that'll give us a good place to start. If you're like me, I like to add a couple of more zeros to the particle amount as well, just so that I'm guaranteed to see all of my particles no matter what. But usually with 100%, we're okay there. Okay, there's our start. The next thing we're going to need is, you guessed it, a birth operator. So we're going to drag that out there, and then connect the little blue node to the empty circle node here to get going. For our birth, we can say we want our particles to be pretty much right off the bat evident. We'll give them, just so that they're not all in the same layer, maybe 3 frames to start emitting. So between frame 0 and 3, we'll emit particles, and then they'll all be out there, and they'll all be done, and they'll all stop. I'll go ahead and leave the amount at 200 for now. We'll see how that works for us, and we'll leave that at default. We can always come back and change it later. Next, I need to tell these particles where they're allowed to be born now that I've told them they can be born. We've got 2 options, a position icon, which uses the icon that we have carefully set up, or a position object, which would allow us to emit particles from an actual object like our sphere here. We took the time to set up the icon, so let's use a position icon. The position icon can stay everything default. Volume is what we want. We want particles to emit from anywhere inside this circle icon that we've got going on here. Then we're going to need to give these particles a shape. At this point, I like to kind of come down here to the display. I'm going to change my ticks to geometry so that I can see as we go. Here's all of our particles being born over the 1, 2, 3. There's all of our particles. And right now they'll show up as X's because we've turned on geometry, but we haven't told them to look like anything yet. So we've got these little red X's or whatever colors in here, telling us that we don't know what those are. So we've got to give them a shape. Let's find down in here our shape operator and drag it up underneath our position icon. As soon as you add it, the default will show up cube at size 10, and that's a monstrously large cube, and wax strips and anything that is kind of a liquid-like substance, probably cubes are not your best bet. So let's go ahead and change that from cube to the sphere 20 sides. We don't need any more than 20 sides. That might even be pushing it, because that's a lot of polygons that our computer then has to think about. Also, I think size 10 is a little ridiculous. Let's try a size of about 5, and then we'll get a whole lot of these guys showing up there. We've also got some control. We can go ahead and turn on the scale percentage, which we can allow our particles to be 100% of their original size. And then we can give them this variation here, anywhere between, let's say, 30% different, which means they can be 30% larger or 30% smaller than our original scale value. Next, we need to tell these particles that they are now allowed to move. Right now they're being born in our icon here, and they're just kind of sitting there, very boring. So let's give them the use of the gravity here. So let's add a force operator. Drag that up underneath there. And inside this force, we are going to go ahead, I'm going to hit by list because it's a little bit more clean. And I've got 3 forces, 2 winds and my gravity. I just want to add the gravity to this one. Okay. And this is them. They're falling down now through our sphere. But you can see, since we gave it 3 frames to go, they start falling, and then we get a little bit more of a thickness of a blob that's going to land on this thing and then drip out and around. If you don't like how fast they're moving, you got a couple of options. You can turn up your gravity, or you can turn up the influence here. I'm going to double it. Let's go to 2,000, and that gives us even a bigger kind of a mass of particles. I think that'll work. We'll go with an influence of 2,000 on that gravity. Next, we need to tell them that when they hit the sphere, they should do something other than fall right through it. Let's do that by adding a collision test underneath here. Now the tests come with this extra little blue node that we can attach to from one event to another. We can use this to send our particles from one behavior into another event where they have an entirely different behavior. In this case, particles will stop falling and they will start hitting the surface of our sphere, whoops, Control Z, and dripping down the sides. So, to the collision, we will add by list our only deflector in our scene, which will be the U deflector. And we can tell these guys, it doesn't really matter, they can bounce fine. You probably don't need to bounce. We can just tell them to continue. We'll just leave everything default for right now. And okay, there's our first event. So this is where our particles are generated. If I'm smart, I'll kind of come up here and I'll rename this particle drop or creation event, or something that makes sense to you and whoever else you have to work with. All right. Next, we need to send them through this little blue node into a secondary event that tells them now they have to pay attention to the surface of the sphere. As of this very moment, we've got them hitting the sphere, and since we left that setting at bounce, they're not going to go through it any longer, which is cool. It might be good for a splash of something, but we want this wax to start cooling down and taking a specific form as a form of drips. So I'm going to come down here, I'm going to drag out a different force, a brand new one, and I'll connect these guys from that new blue node that we have from our collision to this guy. This force, I want to go ahead and by list add both my winds to it. Which means as soon as they hit down here, the winds are going to take over and scatter our particles in pretty much all directions. And we don't want them to be blown away like this, so we can probably use a lot less influence. Let's drop that down to like 100 to 75. And now we're starting to see them kind of a little bit less hairy chaos in here. I'm going to go ahead and turn our ticks once again to geometry. I'll leave them a different color. I'm going to change it to like a bright yellow so we can actually see what's going on. So that as soon as they hit the sphere and travel into the next event, you'll know it because the particles have now changed to this yellow geometry versus that original pink yellow. Alright, now they're kind of scattering in all directions. They're paying attention to our wind, but we don't need that. Okay, but that's not enough. We want them to stick to the surface of our sphere as wax drops should. To do that, we're going to use another test, and this one's called the lock bond operator. Let's go ahead and add it up under our force. This one is a test. It does come with a blue node, but we're not going to use this one. We're going to just kind of keep things moving south, and then we'll make some tails and some trails of wax left behind by the main drips, and then we'll use that to move into our next event. This one we can rename and call it Sticky Drops 1 or something. The lock bond we're going to do, we have a list here that we need to add by list. I'm going to go with the surface of the sphere. We want that to be what the drops are sticking to. Then we need to make some settings changes. Right now it's locked to object. I want it to lock to the surface of that object. I want to come down to the position lock bond settings and restrict the movement of our particles to the surface, which right away we get that plop, and now they're stuck fast to the surface. That's because we've got this 100% force in here. If I just turn that to 0, they're not going to stick solid, but they're going to stay on that surface as they kind of coat a little bit nicer there. So that'll work. We can also do some really fun stuff with this, anything from kind of making something look like it hit water and then bobs up and down in it, to just adding a little bit of slowdown because of the friction of the surface. In this damping here, we've got friction, air, and fluid, or both. Let's just do friction for this one. And let's say let's go 70% of that friction so that we don't get them all slowing too far, but they will slow down and stop, see, a little bit over time. So some at the very top slow down first, and then some that get down toward the bottom there will slow down lastly. We can always come back and adjust these if we want them to drip a little bit farther down our sphere after a while here. I'm also going to come down to the rotation, and well, actually I don't think we need to do anything. Whoops, we don't need to do anything at all to that rotation, because they're not rotating anyway, so no big deal. Alright, good. Let's go back over to our Sticky Drops 1. Underneath this, now we've got our main particles behaving pretty well as wax droplets kind of should be. We are going to go ahead and add some tails to these. We're going to do that by adding spawn. Now, every time we add a spawn test or a collision spawn test, just fair warning, I like to put this all the way back at frame 0, because if I do it all the way over here and I add a spawn that is going to end up, before I make any settings changes to it, kind of infinitely creating particles, I can really crash my computer. So let's put this back to 0 and add our spawn test underneath here. We're going to have these spawn not only once but by travel distance, which means every time a particle travels that amount of space, 1 unit's space in our 3-dimensional world, it's going to lay an egg or create an offspring here. It's going to make a new particle. We'll go ahead and say the step size a little bit more, just so that because they're moving fairly slow, so we can give them a little bit more distance before they create a particle. 1 offspring every time it goes 1.5 units is probably pretty good. With the inherited speed down here, see how they're just kind of spreading out? See, that's what I'm talking about when I say we can crash our computer. It's got to think for a moment there. We'll let it slow the hell down and then move it back to 0. This inherited speed means they're all going to be going the same speed as their parent particles, the ones that bore them. If we reduce that to something much smaller, we can if we go with 0, they'll line up perfectly straight behind. We give them a little bit of inherited speed. They'll go a little bit jagged, some a little closer than others, so we get some of that kind of nice stringy or drippy look. And then our divergence is how far off axis they'll be. 0 divergence means they're going to be straight in a line. A low divergence like 5 means that they'll have, they can go a little bit catty corner as they drip down the side here. We're also going to tell these particles, we've got this size factor here. These particles should be smaller than the main particle because they're remnants, they're leftovers from that main blob that we created. So if we already right away say, well, let's scale them down to 80%, they'll be a little smaller than the big one, which makes our tails skinnier than the original particle. We can actually give them a variation of 20%, so every now and then we get a large lump in there or a small little space in there for our droplets. This one also came with a node. We're going to use that node to travel back down into our next event here, which in order to do, I'm going to copy our lock bond here because we want that same thing. We want all these the tails to stick just exactly the same. I'm going to do that by holding down my shift key until I see the little plus sign show up over my mouse. And then I can just click and drag and drop it, and the clone options will open up for me. I'm going to go ahead and make this one an instance. It says I want them to have the exact same properties. No sense in needing to make changes to both of them when I can just make changes to one and the other one will update automatically. That's what an instance is for. I'm going to go ahead and connect my spawn to that node there. Alright, so here we go. Now the tail should show up as purple tick marks. We can go ahead and change ticks to geometry there, and we can see what's going on. 80%, some of them are a little bigger, some are a little smaller. We've got these tails, and we're getting there, but that's not quite good enough. We can actually tell this to scale out. Now, wax dries up and gets a little stringier as it travels, and we can simulate that by doing a little bit of animation, keyframing, using a scale operator. Let's go ahead and put this back to 0, and we'll add our scale operator above that lock bond number 2. Immediately we can have them scale once, which, if you want your particles to scale differently in every single event, that's a good way to do it. Add that, change the percentage of scale factor to either bigger or smaller, and your particles will change one time. We don't want that to happen. We've got a couple of choices down here, relative first and relative successive. We've used successive to make some tails for water droplets and stuff like that in the past, a little bit skinnier and come to a point. We don't really want that with the wax. We want it to be kind of straight all the way down, leaving kind of almost a slug-like slime trail. So we won't want them to get smaller every single frame. We want relative first this time because we're going to actually do our own animation. We're going to tell them to shrink over time, kind of like they're drying out almost, and going from a liquid into a solid hard wax form. And then we're going to do some keyframing on these. We can leave our constrained proportions. This means all we have to do is animate one of these guys, and the others will kind of follow suit. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my auto key. And I'm going to move this to, let's say, frame, it looks like about finished. Let's go to 35 here. We'll move this up momentarily. And change this from 100 to, let's say, half, 50%. Then between 0 and 100, they'll animate, or 0 and 35, I should say, they'll animate from 100% to 50% in size. And now we've got these real stringy things. Only problem is that, that's kind of going to be, all the scaling is going to happen before they even hit and finish on the sphere. So we can move that up a little bit. I'm going to turn off my auto key and select the particle flow source icon, PF source 001. Then we can see our keyframes that we just created for that scale. All I want to do is select both of them by clicking and dragging a selection marquee around the two keyframes. They should show up white. And then I can just kind of move them. Maybe this shouldn't start until about frame 30. I got a little bit of a bug here where it's not showing. If I click that particle flow source again, they should update and show me now that they're not even going to start scaling. So we got thick, and then they'll start stringing out a little bit more, like so here. All right, that is our particle effect. Now we've just got some tweaking to do here a little bit. Let's see. How can we make these guys fall a little bit harder, a little bit faster here? We've got the lock bond. Now remember, we made these an instant, so I only have to change one of them. And if I reduce that friction even more, we'll get them to maybe string down our sphere a little bit farther. And as they string down, they'll start drying, slowing, coming to a stop, and thinning out. All right. Make sure that anything else we've got going should work pretty good. Seeing these things kind of continue to move a little bit on us. But that should work okay for us. We can always do some other things like, adding a slow or a stop to all of this good stuff later on. I think that'll work pretty nicely. All right. Now that we're done with that, we can let's rename this. We'll call this drops stopping scaling or something along those lines. There's our effect. I'm going to go ahead, before I exit out of here, I'm going to turn off my render node, which kind of comes along when we make the empty flow, just so that we don't get a whole lot of spheres in our final render. We're going to coat them in a blob mesh, so we want them in our scene, but not in our final render. I just click that little icon there to exit out, and now they won't show up when I go ahead and hit render here. Out of the way there. There we go. Now all we need is the blob mesh. So let's go back to our Create tab, our Geometry button, and instead of the drop-down Standard Primitives, let's go down to Compound Objects, where we have blob mesh. Now again, I'm going to put my timeline slider all the way back to 0 before we do this, so that we don't have any serious slowdowns for the sake of our tutorial. And then I'm going to go over to the Modify tab, and that's where I'll change some of these settings. I'm going to go ahead and put a check mark in the large data optimization. Makes it a little bit easier on us to do some of these calculations. The first couple we can just leave at default, and then we've got the evaluation coarseness. We've got two different numbers. One that's going to be for your render, so you'll want that one to be the better value, and then the viewport a little bit less so that it doesn't take over our computer here. I'm going to go ahead and mark the relative coarseness button, which means it's going to change a little bit more accurately based on particle size, so we can get some stringier looking stuff out of it. What this also does is make it, these two values kind of change. Without this, we need to go smaller to make our blob mesh a little bit more rounded out, a little bit more higher resolution. Once I add the relative coarseness button, we kind of need to go higher. So right now, we've got some fairly low numbers. I'm going to go ahead and change the viewport to at least 10 here. Then I can select my blob objects. I'm going to go with Add, and I want to find underneath the PF engine our PF source, and then Add blobs. There we are. We are coded in our, what I've got is an orange looking waxy blob mesh, and as it goes down the side, we start to see these things both thin out, string out, and become something rather waxy. Now, it doesn't look the greatest because I've got a fairly low resolution here still, which is in our viewport at 10. It's actually even worse in our renderer. So I want to like triple that at least. Let's go with at least 30 for our render, and then I'm just going to add some settings that I've saved in the past real quick for a render so that we can actually see the difference from one to the other. Here at frame 100, this is viewport at resolution here of 10, our coarseness of 10. The render is going to triple it and probably look a little bit different. You can try putting the viewport up to 30 as well, but you'll probably have to wait on your computer a little bit longer every time you move the timeline slider because it's got to think about all those extra polygons. Okie dokie dokie dokie. Here, let's see how fast this is going to go. Here we go, not too bad. And now we've got what appears to be some pretty nice wax strips. Try it on some different shapes. Try playing around with certain things like maybe the speed of gravity to pull them down a little farther, or how quickly you want that lock bond to friction the particles and make them slow to stop. And you can get some much different results. Other than that, that's all there is to it. All right, thanks.